our global chats today, joined by our guest, Sean Westcott. We'll introduce Sean in a moment, and of course, my co-host today, Lettie Dalton, who I'm sure a lot of people already know. I'd just like to start out by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands that we're all dialing in from in our respective countries. I think that applies for a lot of us, depending on where we're at. For me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, who are sort of the land that takes up most of the Melbourne region and then through the Yarra. I've just been researching a little bit about that group, the Wurundjeri people. One thing that really stood out that I think is quite relevant for us is the way that they've survived for 60,000 years, which is really quite remarkable. Obviously, the oldest civilization known to man anyway. A lot of that is around storytelling. It's about the sharing of wisdom between groups of people. And obviously, what that leads to is evolution and resilience. So I think that speaks really nicely to what we're actually doing, what Global Chats is really about. It's about bringing in different perspectives. These different perspectives, these different stories help us to make sense of our own stories, which is what I love about it. So I think we've got a really interesting one that we'll be kicking off with today. I think I probably know a lot of people on the call, and my name's Jamie McIver, based here in the Adeption team in Australia. Lettie, maybe quick introduction from you too.
Thank you, Jamie. I love that thought about storytelling. Great to be here. Lettie Dalton, Chief Delivery Officer at Adeption, and I am based in the UK. It has been raining for I don't know how many weeks now here. Looking forward to some sunshine maybe in the next few weeks. I've got my headphones on because it's 9 o'clock at night and children's bedtime. So hopefully this will drown out any background noise from children's bedtime. And I'm just really looking forward to this conversation today and seeing so many familiar faces here as well. Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, awesome. So just a little bit about the format then for those that haven't been to a Global Chats session before. We go for 1 hour, so we've got about 55 minutes left. Most of that time, of course, is taken up with the conversation that we have with Sean, really understanding and exploring some of his ideas and experiences. What we'd invite you to do is put questions into the chat as we go. Wherever we can, we'll try and bring questions into the flow as they fit, but we will also save some time at the end. So maybe 10, 15 minutes at the end just to go more into a Q&A and give people the opportunity to ask Sean questions directly. So yeah, we'll get straight into that. Probably just one note to make on the content and the subject matter for today. Obviously, we're going to be talking about, as you probably read from the brief, we're going to be talking about conflict, particularly focusing on Sean's experience in the conflict in Europe, in Ukraine. We understand that that is sensitive subject matter. So what we've done is we've prepared ourselves to manage it in as careful way as we can, but we understand some of you may even have recent background in conflict. And so we'd invite you to take care of yourself as well. If it does become triggering or difficult, by all means, do whatever you need to do to make yourself comfortable within that. So just acknowledging that is a careful subject matter, and we'll try and manage it responsibly. So to talk a bit about Sean, I know that you'll enjoy someone telling you about yourself, as I know I do. But you've spent a lot of your career, I think 25 years with Nestle in global roles. So you've been going around on assignment around the world in senior leadership roles before you joined PepsiCo. And I think that was around 2020 in a Europe role. So looking after as senior vice president, looking after R&D across Europe. And that was, of course, just before the pandemic. So that gave you a little warm up to what difficult leadership it might look like over those years. And just as things were going back to normal, obviously there was the conflict that blew up in Ukraine. So I think that's sort of the area that we're going to focus in on a little bit, particular experiences through that conflict. But maybe you could elaborate a little bit on your background and what got you into that role, what made it interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie. As you said, I spent a lot of my career with Nestle. I was a global leader for R&D, and I was focused on culinary. And the amazing thing about that job was it put me in people's homes, from favelas in Latin America to slums in Delhi, looking at people and understanding the relationship between culture and cuisine. But after 25 years, I wanted to know who I was as a leader and how much of what I'd achieved was the organization and the relationships I had around me in Nestle, and how much was myself as a leader and my beliefs. And so the opportunity presented itself, and I chose to leave Nestle and move to PepsiCo. If you track the dates, Jamie said, I actually arrived at PepsiCo 1 week before lockdown. And so for the first 2 years of my time in PepsiCo, I had not met virtually everybody I worked with in person, which was quite an extraordinary period and a leadership challenge in and of itself. But the topic of today is really focusing on the time when COVID was ending. And we thought, that we were returning to normal. And I was very excited to be able to get out, meet my teams, and really get to learn the business 2 years after joining. For those that remember, the 24th of February 2022 was when the conflict started in Ukraine. And it's kind of sobering to think that in 1 week from today, it will be 4 years that the people of Ukraine have been experiencing this conflict and enduring all of the hardship that it's brought to them. For us at the time when the conflict started, we had no perspective on what was to come. Suddenly, there were chaotic messages, confusing messages, conflicting information flowing into us as an executive team in Switzerland, in Geneva. And we quickly could see things unraveling and not really being clear on what was going on and what to do. We sat down as a leadership team and tried to process all that we were hearing to try to understand the situation and what our response should be. And we quickly realized that we didn't have the information we needed to make decisions, and that actually what we needed to do was work out a way to help the organization cope with what was happening. And so we created 4 principles. We had a session and we talked about what should our response be? How can we best help our people in this moment? And we crafted these 4 principles, and we'll probably spend a bit of time talking about them during the session today. And those 4 principles were: first, keep our people and families safe and use the resources of the company to support them. The second was to secure our facilities and factories. We were effectively shutting everything down. The third was we provided dairy products, water, many important staple products. So the third was find ways to keep our food and beverages on the shelves, because the Ukrainian people needed these to eat and to feed their families. And the fourth was to prepare to rebuild when the conflict ends. And while we didn't really realize necessarily the impact of what we're doing, those 4 principles proved to be very effective and very powerful, because what they did was they created a space of empowerment for our people, and it gave them permission to take decisions. We realized that they had more information, they had a better read of the situation, and they were better able to respond to what was happening around them. And so that's how we sort of ended up our first reaction, if you like, to the crisis. And from there, we had our teams fleeing. Suddenly you realize that your people are leaving their homes. They're trying to leave the cities to go to the rural areas, or they're trying to leave Ukraine to family across Europe. But they're being stopped. Their husbands, their sons are being turned around and told they have to remain for military service, and they're fleeing, trying to get to safety. And so we realized that we had a tremendous job to do to fulfill that first principle, to keep our people safe. It's the middle of winter. It was bitterly cold, and we would have people who would have fled, maybe with a 6-month-old child, an 18-month-old child, an aging mother-in-law, and they would get off a bus somewhere in a country not knowing what their onward journey would be or what they were going to do. And our people had to respond to these situations and work out how to support them. PepsiCo was, I was so proud of what they did at that time. They quickly marshaled people to meet people at the border. They converted their head office in Warsaw to a hotel, so people could come and stabilize. They brought in immigration lawyers. logistics. They worked out how to provide people with onward journeys, to provide them with accommodation, employment, the legal documents to allow them to function. And so it was quite an extraordinary experience. And for me, and we can talk more about some of the different aspects of it, but just to give you a sense of, what we experienced was chaos, confusion, incomplete information. How we responded as an executive was to establish these 4 principles. And through the course of the coming years, they continued to provide us with a powerful foundation to respond to the situation.
Wow, that's quite a scene that you've set for us there, Sean. I guess it's one of those things I know from the other side of the world. You read about it and you hear about it, but it is, it's a long way away, and really getting a sense to what that all really means for people at an individual collective level is really a whole other matter. Quite moving, obviously, as well. I guess the question I have really is just, I'm looking forward to unpacking a lot more of that, particularly those four points, 4 principles. How did you feel in this moment? Obviously, this is all unexpected and there's a lot of unknown, but how well did you feel you were prepared to take on something like this or be thrown into it, notwithstanding, the chaos and uncertainty, but how prepared as a human or a leader were you?
I think to a large degree, I'm prepared. I'd had extensive crisis training. I'd been in crisis before, recalls of products, all of the kinds of run-of-the-mill business crisis. And I'd experienced some extraordinary business situations, hostile takeovers, mergers, acquisitions, economic crisis, all of these things. But in none of those cases were people fearing for their lives or fearing for their loved ones. And so the boundary, if you like, between professional and personal became very disrupted. It was impossible to connect with your team and to support them without engaging in the personal side and understanding their story, because you literally could not draw on your past experiences to understand what they were going through. And also to really understand and support them, you had to be prepared to connect with what they were experiencing emotionally, and they were very profound. We had one of the team had a very arduous journey to flee to the Czech Republic with her children, and had finally settled there. And then she was informed that her husband, who had to stay behind, his unit was wiped out, and there was one survivor. She didn't know if it was her husband, but she then had to go back to Ukraine to try to find if it was her husband, to go to all these hospitals to see if he was there. And fortunately, he was wounded, but she was able to find him. And what I experienced personally during that period was I experienced some of her fear and some of her, what I guess, terror you would be experiencing. You're traveling, trying to find, is my husband alive? Where is he? What's happening to him? And that wasn't just my experience. It was actually the experience of all of my team of leaders who had people reporting them to in Ukraine. At times it was overwhelming, and it did force a lot of reflection and adaptation in terms of trying to understand what was happening and how to connect and relate to the people. But at the same time, it was incredibly rewarding in terms of the relationships and the engagement and the connection that I had with the team there. So it was certainly something that, as it went on, we recognized that virtually every leader was going to go through this initial period of being overwhelmed, being incredibly confronted, questioning their own personal values, uncomfortable with their ability to respond, but also not really sure how they were going to manage to deal with that and not be affected personally. And we became very good at supporting each other and helping each other understand how we could have a positive impact on those people and those experiences, and how we could take actions that would be supportive to them. And that by doing that, and also hearing back from those people what it meant to them to have us doing that, it gave people the, if you like, the peace and the solace of how they could operate in that complex environment.
Yeah. Sean, thank you for for sharing. It's hard, human wise, it's hard not to feel emotional, and I'm sure there's plenty of emotions coming up. It's a huge and it's a huge topic to cover. So thank you for all that you've shared. Um, you mentioned, we've talked about empathy and sympathy, and when kind of professional empathy isn't enough, and you've talked about connecting and supporting people. What are your kind of takeaways in that regard, and kind of how you got through it and how you supported others to get through it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really important aspect. I think all of us are trained as, as professionals that how important being empathetic can be. It's when you see someone else's situation, you understand it, you can understand what they're experiencing, and you're able to support them. So if we think about a common situation where, for example, you might be restructuring and let someone go, if you have empathy, you can understand what they're doing, but you're also a step back. You're not experiencing those emotions. And so you're able to guide them through the cycle that they go through and hopefully get them to focus on moving forward and continuing their career in another organization. What I found in this situation was it just wasn't enough. And the reason for that was I realized was I was not able to imagine or to be able to understand what they were experiencing and what they needed. In those situations, I was talking about the common business situations. You have reflexes, you've learned, you understand what people need, you understand how to respond. And sometimes you know better what they need than they do themselves because they're very upset or concerned about a range of things. But in this situation, it would be unrealistic or impossible for me to say I could understand intuitively what they needed. And that was one of the challenges we faced as leaders. If you're not prepared to be sympathetic, and to really deeply listen to people and to hear their stories and also to feel some of their emotions, I think it's very difficult to help and to respond to them. And initially that was incredibly confronting. And as I said, it took every leader that either may have during those times taken over a team or whatever experienced this feeling of being overwhelmed. But through reflection, through conversation, you're able to find a perspective on it and realize that through that sympathy, you can actually discover and understand the needs of your team and be able to respond to them. And it can seem quite strange. We had one situation. So my boss was fantastic. We would have these connects regularly, Zoom connects, where we would talk to them. And they're often sitting in a bomb shelter with their laptops on their knees, connecting to us while they're under airstrikes, which was very surreal. And my boss, who was the chief technology officer, said, "What could we do for you? What aren't we doing for you? What do you need from us?" And they said, "We need power banks for our laptops." And we're saying, "But don't you have more, your families, or do you have needs?" I said, "Oh, no, you don't understand. With the airstrikes knocking out our power system, we only have a few hours of electricity a day. We have to cook our food, wash our clothes, clean our houses, warm our houses, do all those things. So when the power's on, we have to do all of that. But then we have nothing to do for the rest of the time. We sit there with our fears, afraid." The company had guaranteed everybody in Ukraine employment for at least 12 months at the time. And it ended up being said, didn't matter whether you worked, didn't work, didn't matter if you fled to Czech Republic or whatever, you would be paid, you would keep your job. Those people wanted to earn their jobs, even in those situations. And so when the power went out, their laptops would only last about an hour or two before they drained. And all they wanted was power banks so that when they were sitting there with nothing but their fears and their concerns, work was a welcome distraction. Work was something that they could actually give back to the company that was supporting them. And it was just so unexpected to understand that that was their need, but why it was such an important need for them. And of course, we had some crazy policy that contractors were not entitled to power banks. And so they hadn't been able to get them. Suffice to say, a quick call to the head of procurement, and it was fixed in about 24 hours. But for me, the point really was, it was only through being sympathetic and really understanding their situation and to an extent experiencing it as best you can that you understand their needs and you're best able to support those people.
Something that stands out for me there, Sean, is the idea of vulnerability, because I was just thinking as I was listening to your story about why is that hard for a leader to do? What does it require? And I think particularly in larger multinationals, right, where there's a little bit more of a hierarchical dynamic, and often people go to the leader for the answers. This need to enter a discussion just listening, without an assumption that I know what the problem is, without even really any level of certainty that I can fix whatever it is that's being brought up. That requires the leader to experience a lot of vulnerability, I would have thought. I mean, is that a good way to think about it?
Yeah, it was absolutely a case of you had to park your ego at the door. You don't have all the answers. You barely understand the situation. And even if you understand the situation, you don't understand the dynamics of it. And what we realized early on, coming back to those four principles, was it was so important for us to create a space of empowerment for every single person. I can't, I realize I can't empower anybody. I can't say to somebody, you're empowered, go and tackle this. What you can do is create a space of empowerment and then encouraging the people in those situations to use those principles, to use that space of empowerment, to take the decisions and to coach those people in those moments. You absolutely have to be vulnerable because you've got to ask the better questions because you don't understand the situation. You don't understand the impact of that decision. And so you have to be very open, very still, and ask all those questions that are coaching people through the decision. Is this a decision you need to take now? What information do you need to take this decision? What will be the impact of implementing this decision? What do you need to have to make this decision work? All of those things requires you to be, mentally very still, very connected to the person, and completely open to them because the consequences of the decisions are so much more profound than do you make your profit or market share or whatever. It's is it safe to open the factory? And there's no clear-cut answers. And we reopened the factory. We did have a missile strike that struck the warehouse, and it unfortunately killed one person because the facilities were being targeted. But a lot of your decisions have a life or death consequence, or have the potential to have not just a business outcome, but a personal outcome. And so you really have to park your ego at the door and be completely in the moment with that person, trying to understand through their eyes and just trying to help them process and take a decision or act in what is going to be a safe and hopefully, productive way.
Amazing.
There's a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat, Sean. I'd love to unpack the four principles a little bit more and also talk a bit more about how this has changed you as a leader and also how it applies to kind of non-extraordinary circumstances. Like how do we as leaders set up an environment where we as prepared as we can be for high pressure times? But there's a couple of things in the chat. Tim was asking about the difference between empathy and sympathy in the context of leading through extraordinary situations. And a slightly different question from John, but he'd be interested to know what you needed to help you that perhaps you didn't have initially. So there may be two separate answers, but a couple of questions there.
Yeah. I think the thing I needed most during that time was people to talk to process what I was seeing. So my wife was very valuable, and she often would be the person that was there when I needed it most. So just so everyone understands, from the first day of the war, 7 days a week, we created a WhatsApp group. And every morning when I would have my coffee, when it was the quietest part of my day, I would message the team. I would have checked the news sites. And if something bad had happened overnight, I'd ask everyone to check in, how they were doing, how their families were doing, did they have any needs, and so on. And I asked them after about 12 months, was that helpful or unhelpful to them? And they told me that we know that we have a guardian angel or guardian angels that are looking over us every day. And if ever we need anything, we don't have to go to somebody to ask. Someone's going to ask us what we need every day. And the one thing they asked is we never stop sending those messages every day of checking in to see how they were doing. But they could also be incredibly confronting. I remember vividly one Sunday morning, I was checking in. I knew that they'd had massive airstrikes, and one of the team had sent me a video. It's like a Hollywood scene. The street had cars with chunks of rubble crushing them, people walking around covered in dust and blood, crying. It's winter, it's snowing. And my team member said, if that missile had have been sent with one click to the left, it would have struck my end of the building and I wouldn't have sent you a video. It struck the other end of her residential building. And for me personally, it's just horrifying. It's not a news clip. It's not something you go, oh, that's terrible, and the next news clip comes on. This is somebody who you've talked to who's living that fear, and has realized that, by the grace of 1 degree on a aiming thing, that they're here and their neighbor is not. And it accumulates, and all the leaders experience this to a greater or lesser extent. I had a wonderful boss, my CTO, and about 1 to 2 o'clock every day for probably 2 years, my Zoom would go off. He'd be in New York. He'd be having his coffee. How are you doing today? How's the team in Ukraine? What do you need? What decisions do you face today? What can I do to help you? And I basically kept my diary clear, because those 10, 15 minutes we'd have a talk each morning was just an opportunity for me to get outside my own head and talk to someone who's completely focused on my well-being and so on. So the people around you, family, bosses, friends, and then many of my colleagues in the executive who were experiencing the same things, when we were together, we would always take time to talk it through. You need someone to talk it through, and you need to have someone to remind you, most importantly, to be kind to yourself. You feel that in that situation, you're privileged, safe, and secure, and that you have no right to expect, all that support, all that emotional release, because you're not going through what your team's going through. But, having people to remind you to be kind to yourself and to get outside your own head and talk through those experiences, it just helps you find perspective and balance.
That's a really good one, John. Thank you for that question. Great question too. I'm interested to hear a bit of Sean about the reaction and response of the broader organisation, the people in the other countries that you are obviously leading R&D across the region. I guess there's a bit of context around, there's a business that's continuing, and then there's this enormous human need that you've got, and how you thought about the balance, but also what response you saw from people in other countries to the situation. Often when we go through transformation and crisis, it creates a lot of friction in the organisation, resistance even. I'm just curious to know, did you see something different on this occasion?
Yeah, certainly. I think that, in an organisation, people embrace the culture, they embrace the relationships. It's very important to them. And our biggest challenge was, if you like, compartmentalizing who was directly supporting the team and helping them, and who was, really need to continue the business. And quite often the best thing other people in the organization could do was continue to focus on their roles and what they could contribute, because we were drawing off from their supply chains to provide products to Ukraine. And also because it's such an intense experience, it can be overwhelming for the team in Ukraine, with everyone who wants to support and to help them. So we found ways to channel people's need to connect and contribute to those people, whether it was through sharing the stories of what the company was doing, for the people that were fleeing, and eventually when those people returned, providing matching donations and other platforms for people to be able to contribute personally to the situation, and then also sometimes facilitating people that felt the need to do more. So in the early days, one of the biggest issues they had was they just had no medical supplies in Ukraine, and people were being injured and not able to be operated on. But I know of people in the organization who felt that they had personal connections and so on. They literally got a list of bandages and other medicines that were needed, worked with medical people out of the country. They bought them and they literally drove them to the Romanian border, where they were met by someone from the Ukrainian team, who would then take it on to surgeons and so on in the hospital. And in some of those cases, the company would, in whatever way it could, would support or facilitate those individual actions. So I think it was giving broader people an ability to contribute and to allow them to support the people, but at the same time, putting in place some boundaries, recognizing that there were certain groups of people who were very focused on working with those people, and they were in the best position to support them as they went through that. But from a business perspective, there was never any tension. The PepsiCo global executive, was very quick to say, we agree with the principles and we approach. We know that's going to come with a cost. We don't know what that cost is, but we're going to treat that as an extraordinary item. Please do what you're doing as a leadership team. It's very important to us as a company that you do that. And it was a significant amount of money that, if you like, the PepsiCo Europe team took on to be able to provide all of the support and very broad support for that. But there was never any tension from the business around what we're doing or why we're doing it. In fact, quite the opposite. It was seen as being a real expression of the culture of the company, what we aspired to be, and the rest of the business was recognized that they needed to get on with business, and in that own way, that was one of the most powerful things they could do to support the team as well.
I think that speaks to a couple of your principles too, doesn't it? Around ways to keep products available, preparing to rebuild. I mean, people need the organization. There's an interdependent relationship there, isn't there, with the need to sustain the organization so people have support and ongoing employment. So, yeah. Amazing.
A reflection, sure. I mean, so many reflections, and I'm sure across the group, lots of, reflections happening. What stands out for me is that connection, the fundamentals. I don't even want to call them the basics because they're not always basic, but connecting, listening, that human to humanness of what was so pivotal, it sounds like, in getting through this situation. How do you think it's changed you as a leader? Like what's different about your leadership now? Obviously, we've got the principles that you put in place then and worked to, but what about now as a leader? What do you think are your kind of shifts that have stayed with you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was quite, we talk this, we read this, and we think all these things about, people are our greatest resource and all this kind of stuff. In this situation where everything is stripped away, I realized two things. One is that companies do an amazing job of employing talented people. And the second is that all of those people have more potential than they're realizing or that we're tapping. And that really, as leaders, if we create the conditions, if we create the space around them for them to thrive and respond, and trust them far more than we ever have, what they will deliver and what they will achieve and what they're capable of is really what I think helped us go through this situation. And I honestly think that it would help any business realize its potential. Strategies, playbook, all of these things. There's the saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it's so true. Working with these people in a situation where everything was stripped away, and just realizing that these people were of such high quality, and that just by giving them, even in these situations, giving them space, giving them opportunity, working out what was blocking them from realizing that, which is obviously quite extreme in the situation, but what you got back for trusting them and then focusing as a leader on creating that space, trusting them with their decisions and supporting them. I think that was why we were able to work through the situation in the way that we were, because it really, if you like, it's a heat experience in that sense where, the things that you might know theoretically, or you may have dealt with in a very stable, predictable situation, now you're doing it in a context that's way beyond that. And it just reinforced to me that, that I think that is how leaders need to respond in the future. The outside world is going to be more volatile, uncertain. I mean, we could all rattle off 10 things that we've seen happen in the last 12 months that are destabilizing the world and, the rule of order, all of these things changing. But our teams are often the best place to make decisions, to implement them and to make those decisions work, not the leaders who are, often far removed from that. So really focusing on how do you build that culture of empowerment? How do you show up to connect with people, to coach them and to support them through the decisions they take within that? And how do you drive the learning and the growth of those people, whether it was the people in Ukraine or the leaders in Europe that were supporting them. To me, that was the real leadership, personal growth, and the leadership insights that I gained from that situation.
Yeah, beautifully said, Sean. Love that.
I mean, it sounds, to play that back a little bit, it sounds like what we can take from a situation like this is, if we compare it to normal circumstances, we aren't actually getting the full potential out of people. And so the breakthrough question is, how do we create the conditions to get not only get out of people their potential, but to enable people to grow in a way that they are capable and have the capacity to grow without it needing to be war in order to
Yeah.
in order to do that. So I don't know that I don't have an answer for that, by the way, but that's just something that came to mind there. There is this capacity that people inherently have, and we know it from seeing these situations as
Mm.
you've described. Yes, we talk a lot about the heat experiences, thinking about vertical development, heat experiences, colliding perspectives, reflection. So I think we've got that formula, but I'm just wondering, is there something else that we can take from this? Yeah, question to explore. I don't know if you've got a comment on that. Otherwise, there's a great question coming up from Kirsty too.
Yeah, just really quickly, I do have a perspective on that, Jamie. In this situation that we found was, as a leadership team, before we set plans or strategies or whatever, we focused on the principles that we felt were needed for that situation. And that was really to create a common ground between us and everybody else. But fundamentally, it was to let go of control and decision making. You know, we were all executives or whatever, so you feel that that's your job, but to let go of that and to focus instead on um, recognizing who was best placed to make that decision. What support did they need to make the decision? And the way I always feel it is, in an organization, you look at which way does the energy flow? Does the energy flow up from the people at the bottom of the organization to the top, or does it flow from the top to the bottom? It has to be the latter. We talk about servant leadership, all of these things. The leaders have to recognize that you can set the strategy, where do you want to be and how do you get there? But really, the how do you get there will be worked out by all the people across your organization, and using principles and other things to have conversations with people around what's their place in that. Why are they the people best placed to execute that part of the strategy or to deliver whatever plan or whatever goal? And then focusing on coaching people through articulating the decisions they need to take, understanding how those decisions could unfold, and then supporting them and implementing that, and very quickly getting them the resources. I mean, that was the other thing. We were redeploying resources in a heartbeat to be able to support that. And I think carrying those things into in a normal business context, there's no reason why you can't take those lessons and apply them. It's just, you have to find another way to create, if you like, the growth, the tension that drives that growth and so on with people by how you show up.
Totally. Lettie, I'm just noticing this this is a topic we're talking a lot about to our clients about at the moment, under the banner of adaptive leadership, right? And a lot of people will be familiar with the work of Ron Heifetz in that area, but a lot of that is around, if you've got the problem, then you're part of the problem, part of the solution. So involve the people, distributed leadership power to enable people to make the decisions closer to where the information is, where the crisis is, or whatever the case may be. One of the things that I think can get in the way a little bit is the relinquishing of power. To redistribute power, right? Someone needs to let go, and in order for someone else to take it, often it seems to be it's the relinquishing that can be. And I wonder about the role of identity in that, where people may identify with the power that they have. That's just something that comes to mind for me. Lettie, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I think I mean, it's fascinating reflections. I've got so many thoughts. And I think sometimes it's the crisis of a situation that forces our hand,
Yeah.
at times like this with things like that. And I guess what I'm reflecting on and through this whole situation is that we're talking on a really extreme scale here and a really significant event and set of circumstances. And Sean, to go back to what you said about the environment that we're operating in now, chaos and disruption and uncertainty, is almost like our to much different and lesser extent is as leaders, what we're kind of moving more and more into is this world where things are changing quickly. And um, I could ask all of you to think of something topical at the moment that's going on that's chaotic, either in your own lives or in the world. And I don't doubt for a second you could all bring multiple things to mind. And so I think what we've got here is the opportunity to see a kind of magnified or blown up version of what it can look like. But actually, as leaders, we're all dealing, as human beings, actually, we're all dealing with this on a scale. And so I'm fascinated, Sean, in the lessons around both how it affected you and what you've taken from it, but also as leaders and what we can do here and now in the environments that we're in. There could be some people here who are in really high pressure, chaotic environments right now, or that are preparing for that kind of, moving into the near future. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm kind of zooming in and zooming
Yeah.
out, but yeah.
Look, I pick up on those 2 points. One was, you asked about identity, Jamie. I mean, if I just focus on, we took a lot of learning from it as an executive group. And one of the first things we did was we confronted our identity. We're a group of alphas who are all smarter than each other. And we were quite competitive in challenging each other in meetings, but not in a productive way. If we asked people, I actually did, I went and asked a number of people who presented to the executive, what was their experience? And someone said, we know how all the assistants sit out the door to the boardroom. When you walk up to go into the boardroom, they say, good luck. Not in a good way, but, in let's hope that you come out in one piece kind of way. And we reflected as a leadership team that through this crisis, why were we able to perform at a different level when we were faced with such a situation? And why did it take that situation to push us to that level? We were clearly capable of doing it. We clearly had the potential to operate as a team at a completely different level, and a level that was incredibly rewarding and incredibly impactful. Look, it's a bad way to say it, but we would say, why do we need a gun held to our head before we can perform at that level? But we actually sat back and reflected as a leadership team and recognized that we had to fundamentally change how we function as a leadership team. And what we had employed in that situation, creating a space of empowerment, focusing on coaching people through the decisions, understanding the assumptions they needed to make their strategies work, understanding the risks, how would they mitigate them. We weren't discussing that. We were arguing whether their target was perfect or not, or whether they were doing a good job or not. And so we completely changed the focus of leadership. We identified 4 behaviors in our leadership team were the biggest blockers to us accessing that potential. And I took the role of coach of the leadership team. And at the end of every meeting, we would score ourselves on those 4 behaviors. We would talk about what had occurred during the day. And we would set, in the beginning of the next session, we would talk about what was 1 or 2 things we wanted to focus on as a leadership team. And we went from people coming to the leadership team, being told good luck as you go in, to before people left the leadership team, we asked them, how was this meeting for you? Did you get everything you needed? Do you feel you have the support and the resources you need to implement your strategy? And we actually had presenters join in assessing the team on the 4 behaviors. So ultimately, the people that presented to us would judge the performance of the executive team in how they responded to the people that they were asking to do the work that was required to do with this business strategy. So it did change fundamentally how the leadership team operated. And over time, all the leaders on the team basically said this experience went from, do I really have to come to Geneva for an executive meeting? It's going to be a complete waste of my time and it's just going to be a series of battles, to I want to go to Geneva because I think that I can help another market unlock their strategy. I've got some ideas on what they're trying to achieve, or I want to make sure my team has the support of all the different functions for their strategy, and knowing that they were going to get it. So yeah, we did take from that and tried to work out how could we achieve that level of performance, unlock the performance that we knew we were capable of as a team without that crisis to trigger it.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome, awesome. You've inadvertently answered Amy Baker's question too, so which was sort of really going into that point around how well you were set up and what you needed to do as a leadership team. Um, just while I'm going to ask another question here we've got from Kirsty, and I'm just going to invite people to reflect a bit and to start putting into chat if there are any other questions that are burning for people. We may not have a chance to cover them all, but it'd be good to get a few more. And there's a really interesting one from Kirsty that I'm really curious about as well, and that relates to Russia. And was there a Russia business that you were also managing? How did you do that?
Yes. Yeah, we did have had a business in Russia, so it was fundamentally a dairy business. We withdrew all of our global brands immediately, and we ceased investment in the business, but we continued to operate it. We had a responsibility to thousands and thousands of dairy producers, farmers with cows, but also our products were staples that, again, were fundamental to people eating every day. It was very difficult, and that was a larger business decision. So we decided to continue to operate, but we also were very transparent, I think, with the world around what we did. There was SEC submissions filed explaining the limitations of what we're doing. We saw a lot of other companies, big companies like ours, play a lot of games, obfuscate and so on and so forth. So I think at one level we were very clear on why we continue to operate and what we operate. On a personal level, I had a large team in Russia, and I can tell you that the majority of those people were horrified with what they had. You learn a lot. A lot of people in Russia are Ukrainian. In fact, historically, Rus, Moscow was where the rulers of Rus, who were in Ukraine, would send little princes to learn how to govern. And so there are deep ties between these two countries. Many of my team had Ukrainian surnames, and they had family in Ukraine. There were families of employees who part of their family was in Ukraine, part of their family was in Russia. So it's an incredibly ambiguous situation. And I found it very difficult to, you could fall into self-righteousness or a particular moral view, but I found it was far more complicated than that. And in the end, where I came to was the people that I worked with were good people who were trying to do a job, and their job was important to keep fundamental products, milk, butter, whatever on the table that people needed. And so I was able to find, if you like, at least an acceptable perspective on that. And those people need supported. I can tell you, like, we had one of the team, her brother was conscripted and he was killed. And so it wasn't, you on both sides, you're seeing the humanitarian cost, you're seeing the pain and the anguish that this horrible conflict caused, and you couldn't escape it on either side. So it was challenging, and a lot of people found it challenging to try to hold the two things in their heads. But equally, we were very open with the Ukrainian team, and they were the people in the Russian teams were their friends, were their mentors, people that they'd worked with for a long period of time, and they were as concerned about each other. I literally had one of my leaders who was Russian absolutely read me on a Zoom meeting. It's not your call to tell me that I can't care for my team in Ukraine. They are my people. I've worked with them all this time. I need to support them. Now, it was illegal for them to do that. They would have been treated as traitors because they would have been given support. But, at a personal level, it's different to what it was at a political level. And so you have to work your way through that and find your own balance with that. And it's not easy.
Yeah. Sean, thank you for that sharing. There's another question that's popped up, and actually a similar question to one that I had that I'm going to share with you from Mark. You mentioned I think you called them behaviors in your leadership team. So one question is around what were they, and then as a leader or a human, what have you learned that could inform us and how we lead in other context? So there's a
Mhm.
couple of questions in there.
Yeah, I can like the behaviors are just some words, but they meant a lot to us as a team. So, for example, one was help and ask for help. And actually, that was the one behavior that we were terrible at because everyone was, I don't need help. I'm a general manager of this country. I know what I'm doing. And if I ask for help, I'm weak. Um, so this ability to help and ask for help was actually when we had a breakthrough in team performance because it changed how people firstly reacted. So when someone came and presented their annual operating plan, they weren't being challenged on it. That we were being asked, what are the key elements of this? What are the assumptions that are going to drive this forward? Do you have the resources you need? What could go wrong? What could block you? Like the dialogue changed fundamentally. So I think, Lettie, I could give you the four behaviors, but they were our behaviors for our team. And I think that anyone who is, um, you know, invested in focusing teams can probably identify what are the blockages or the behaviors that most derail this team. And they're pretty easy to find. And then choosing which ones you think are going to have the greatest leverage to unlock your team performance. We worked on those same behaviors for 3 years, and we didn't have a breakthrough on the help and ask for help until about the third year. And we could see the business performance shift once we had that breakthrough. I mean, just realizing that you as a leadership team are the biggest problem is often a sobering thought. Um,
Could I just say on that, Sean, sorry to break your thought, but that speaks to me about the idea that there's not one formula.
no.
There it is. What's valuable and important to us as a group of human beings, unique group of human beings, and what's our context, and then the behaviors, I guess, come out of that. So really,
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah, and even to the point where when I announced that I was retiring, I'd be leaving, a number of people came and sat down and talked with me and said, "What we've done to unlock the team performance, I'd like to take up the baton. And these are my ideas, and this is how I think we can unlock the next level of team performance." So to see that virtuous circle emerging and to see different leaders in the team taking responsibility for the performance of the team was incredibly rewarding. To your second question, Lettie. I think the thought that it provokes in me was this. I use the word kindness or compassion. I mean, uh, I think that, and as we go through different business situations and often difficult situations, they can be mergers and acquisitions, they can be restructures and so on. We know that sometimes we have to do difficult things that are very challenging for the employees impacted. But the thing I learned through all of this is it can always be done with kindness and compassion, by actually taking the time to understand that person, what they're experiencing, whether it's in the space of empathy or sympathy or wherever you need to be. I think when we show up with kindness and compassion and recognizing that, let's say someone's role's been eliminated, they're going to leave the organization. If your focus is on telling them that they're leaving, then I think you're falling short of that. If your focus instead is on, I realize this is a shock to you, but you brought a lot of strengths and you have a lot of potential to fulfill. There are employees out there that will want that. How do we get you past the shock of the separation and the fear and concern you have for your family and financial situation? How do we get you to focus on, what made you successful in this role and why that would be something you can market and engage people? And, some of the leaders that went through this, we did have to do restructure. And I was incredibly proud of them because they literally had people coming up saying, I'm going to be okay. I've actually got this fantastic new job. I'm really excited about it. And I've moved on. And that's how we, judge success, was how successful are the people leaving the organization, securing their next role and moving on. And I think that comes from this, that it's not mutually exclusive. Like, it's not that in business, you're faced with difficult things. But I think if you show up with kindness and compassion and you really are connecting with people and their situation and their need, you can that puts you in the best position to coach them, to support them, to guide them through, often when they're not able to do it themselves, but also to leverage the resources of the organization, which we did in this situation at a grand level, but even at a smaller level to help them move on, because you have that obligation. And the payback is everyone sees you do it. I had to let 3 leaders go. I flew in 2 days from Turkey to England to Ireland and met every single one of them. And one of the assistants took me aside and said, it didn't go unnoticed. She said, normally in this company, they'd just be called and told, everyone knew you flew from country to country to country to sit down and show respect to those people. And they all moved on, they were fine. But it when you exhibit that and you live that, everyone who's not impacted goes, if that ever happens to me, I'm going to be okay. And it creates the psychological safety. It supports that space of empowerment that we've talked about. So it's just, to me, that's one of the biggest learning is that there's no business situation where kindness, compassion, whatever you call it, is something that you can set aside. It's actually something that you have to find in every situation. And I'm firmly convinced that if you do that, you'll get the best outcome.
Yeah,
Sorry, Lettie.
I'm going to hand back to you, Jamie, actually, because I'm aware of the time, but I do just want to say, Sean, for all that you shared, actually, there's just so many gems of wisdom, and I want to acknowledge the sense that you've made and the wisdom that you've brought here, and how incredibly insightfully you've been able to articulate it, and help us come along and some of those learnings with you. So thank you for being so wonderful. There's a ton of other questions that we could ask, but I'm mindful of the time, so I'm gonna hand back to Jamie. But just thank you, Sean. Just wonderful insights.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I met Sean for the first time about 6 months ago. We had a coffee down on Beach Road down in Port Melbourne, and I started to hear some of Sean's stories. Probably two things struck me. One was the stories and the impact and the significance of these stories and what it can unlock for us. But secondly was the humility and the compassion that Sean has in telling the stories. In particular, what's really clear to me is just this growth. It's a story of growth, really, not only for Sean as an individual, but for other people in the organization. So I really want to thank you, Sean, for coming along and sharing it. I also just, in the last minute, want to make a call out to the team behind Global Chats, particularly Devon Cantley, who did such a great job of shepherding Lettie, Sean, and myself through the process. She's the unsung hero here. And just to mention that in March, our next Global Chats is with Griff Davenport. This is going to be a very, very interesting one. Griff actually led the DLR group through 2000% growth. And I think we're all pretty curious to hear, how does that happen? So if you're able to, Lettie's putting the details in here to register, please come along and join us. Lettie, absolute pleasure working with you as always.
And you, my friend.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for coming, and obviously we'll get some videos and insights out soon. Thanks again, Sean.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much.